Kasia sat on the edge of the sidewalk of the city's main street with her arms around her knees. Her worn-down jacket, once a protection from the cold, had long since lost its purpose. It was more like an old floor rag, stained with stains and holes through which the icy wind pierced. Beside it lay her only companion, a piece of cardboard that she carried everywhere. It was her roof, her mattress, and perhaps the last thing that belonged to her alone. In her other hand she clutched a paper cup, which was sometimes filled with coins from random passers-by. But this evening the cup was practically empty. The city around her was living its life. Someone was hurrying home after work, someone was cheerfully discussing evening plans, and someone was leisurely strolling with their children. For them, she was just a part of the cityscape, as invisible as streetlights or garbage cans. Kasia watched the flow of people. Her bare feet, calloused by cold and pain, had long ago stopped feeling the sidewalk beneath them. Hunger gnawed at her from the inside, reminding her of itself with a sharp pain in her stomach. The last time she'd eaten was 2 days ago, a few breadcrumbs she'd found by the dumpster. She knew she should ask for help, but it was always hard. Her voice, hoarse from endless attempts to reach out for other people's kindness, sounded barely audible. "Please, just a little, I haven't eaten anything in 2 days." The passers-by did not react. Her words merged with the noise of the street. It was her usual day. She would wake up in the morning on the cold ground, gather her meager belongings and set out again to find food or some kind of support. Sometimes her path lay to garbage cans outside restaurants, sometimes to crowded places where she could hope for a handout. She stepped forward again, holding out her hand with a plastic cup. "Please help, at least for bread." Her voice trembled, but again went unheard. People averted their eyes as if she didn't exist. One man quickened his step as she approached. The young girl wearing headphones didn't even turn her head. An elderly couple strolling slowly along the street deliberately turned away so as not to meet her gaze. Finally, Kasia approached a woman wearing an expensive coat with a fur collar. In the woman's hands were packages from well-known boutiques. Kasia timidly stepped closer. "Excuse me, just a little, for bread," she whispered. The woman stopped, but instead of help, disgust appeared on her face. She yanked her hand away sharply, as if Kasia might have infected her with something. "What are you doing, you filthy thing? That coat is worth more than you'll earn in your whole life," she said angrily. Kasia, confused, tried to justify herself. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." But the woman wasn't going to listen. Her face was twisted with anger, and her voice sounded louder than necessary. "People like you should be taken off the streets. All thieves and beggars." The crowd around him began to slow down, the passers-by watching with interest. Someone took out his cell phone and started filming. The woman, noticing this, did not stop, but instead pushed the girl. The porridge fell on the sidewalk, her cup rolled, and a few coins scattered on the asphalt. She was left sitting on the cold ground, feeling her heart clench with pain and humiliation. Tears poured down her cheeks, but she didn't dare to even pick up her coins. People walked by, filming her on their phones, discussing her, but no one offered to help. Kasia stood up, grabbing her piece of cardboard. Her legs trembled and a strange emptiness settled in her chest. She ran away, feeling the cold wind hitting her face. The street seemed endless, and every movement was difficult. Kasia reached a dark alley and pressed her back against the cold brick wall, breathing heavily. Her lungs felt like they were being squeezed by icy air, and her mind was spinning with thoughts, one worse than the other. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, but they wouldn't stop flowing. Why? Why does everyone think I'm dirty, unnecessary? I've done nothing wrong to anyone. Her thoughts sounded like a desperate cry that no one would ever hear. She looked at the piece of cardboard she clutched to her chest. That scrap was her home, her only protection from the cold rain and wind. For the first time in a long time, Kasia wondered, if I just disappear, will anyone notice? Or would no one care? But she couldn't give up. Her life was a struggle, every day, every hour, every step. She wiped her face again and took a step deeper into the alley, toward the barely visible lights in the distance. Those lights reminded her of something warm, even if she didn't know what awaited her there. After a few minutes, her feet led her to a familiar place, the backyard of a restaurant. The place always smelled of roasted meat, fresh bread, and spices. That smell was like a beacon to her, promising a tiny chance of satiation. She looked around, making sure no one was around. Restaurant workers didn't like people like her. They could shout her out, and sometimes throw something heavy at her. Kasia crouched down next to the dumpster and pulled her hood up so as not to attract attention. She cautiously peered inside the container and began to rummage through its contents. Under her fingers she could feel raw paper, plastic wrappers, leftovers. But suddenly her hands fumbled for something solid. With slightly shaking hands, she pulled a piece of bread out of the container. It was in a whole package and looked almost fresh. Her heart beat faster and she whispered softly, "Thank you." She quickly tucked the find into her pocket, looking around as if afraid someone might take it away. Her joy was so strong that she even felt a slight warmth inside. But that feeling faded quickly when Kasia noticed a shadow flickering outside the kitchen window. She froze. From the restaurant came the sound of dishes, the hum of voices, and muffled footsteps. Her eyes stopped at the open kitchen window where the bustle of the cooks could be seen. Everything seemed to be in order, but something alerted her. Her attention was drawn to a woman in a bright red dress entering the kitchen. Her high heels clinked on the tiles, and her posture and manner of movement suggested that she was no ordinary visitor. This was Veronika Wisławska, the wife of Stanislav Wisławski, a prominent businessman. Kasia knew her, not personally, of course, but had seen her in discarded magazines and on advertising posters. Veronika seemed to know exactly what she was doing. She walked over to the table where the cook had just finished serving a gourmet meal. Glancing around to make sure no one was watching her, the woman pulled a small glass vial from her purse. Kasia tensed as she watched Veronika carefully unscrew the cap and drip a few drops from the vial onto the dish. The woman moved confidently, as if it wasn't the first time she'd done this. Then she quickly tucked the vial back into her purse and, adjusting her dress, left as elegantly as she had entered. Kasia felt her heart squeeze. She didn't know what exactly she had just seen, but her intuition told her that it was something bad. The girl cautiously looked at the plate Veronika had left behind. Her thoughts were racing. Is it poison? But why? What's going on? Her gaze froze on the plate, and inside everything went cold. She realized this was no accident. This can't be a joke, she thought, feeling a shiver creep through her entire body. A catastrophic thought flashed through her mind: it's poison. And someone could die. Her hands involuntarily clenched into fists and her heart pounded frantically. Kasia knew she had to do something, but fear was holding her back. Who's going to believe me? They all see me as nothing but a dirty beggar. If I barge in there, they'll just kick me out. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her trembling. If I keep quiet, it'll be on my conscience. I can't just walk away. Gaining courage, Kasia cast one last glance at the open window and took a step forward. She knew she didn't have much time. Kasia took a few more steps towards the restaurant, feeling her legs feel like they were filled with lead. Ahead towered massive glass doors, beyond which stretched a world of luxury and sophistication. A huge chandelier in the center of the room cast a golden glow, and waiters scurried between tables laden with crystal glasses and china plates. At the entrance stood the guard, a tall, stout man with a stern look. He noticed Kasia at once and frowned. His massive figure seemed an insurmountable obstacle. "Where are you going?" he growled, blocking her way. "This place is not for the likes of you." Kasia stopped, feeling her heart pounding somewhere in her throat. But she couldn't let herself back down. "Please, there's danger out there, you have to let me in." Her voice sounded hoarse, but she could hear the desperate determination in it. The guard laughed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Danger? It's dangerous for you to be here. The janitors will have a hard time cleaning it up. Get out before I call the police. Listen, Kasia stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. I saw the woman put something in the food. It's poison. If you don't stop it, someone could die. The guard squinted his eyes and put his hand down on the walkie-talkie. That's enough. Go away or I'll throw you out of here myself. Tears rolled down Kasia's face, but she wasn't going to give up. Taking a deep breath, she turned away and pretended to leave, but in reality she was lurking around the corner. Her mind was feverishly searching for a way out. A few minutes later, an expensive black car pulled up and the guard hurried to it to open the door for the passengers. Kasia, noticing that his attention was distracted, skirted inside the restaurant. She found herself in a world seen only through windows. The marble floor glistened beneath her bare feet, and huge paintings in gilded frames hung on the walls. The hall was filled with guests enjoying a sumptuous meal. Her gaze darted frantically around until she saw the center table. There, surrounded by guests, sat a man in an expensive suit, Stanislav Wisławski. His face seemed familiar to her, confident, with a slight shadow of fatigue. It had been in the news more than once. Kasia froze as she saw the waiter walk up to his table with that very dish. Her heart clenched as she realized there was almost no time left. Gaining air in her chest, she rushed to the table and shouted loudly. Don't eat that. Stop. It's poison. The room instantly fell into silence. All eyes were fixed on the girl with dirty hands and bare feet, who suddenly appeared in this sophisticated place. Stanislav raised his fork, but froze, looking at Kasia. What's going on here? His voice was surprised and cold. This dish is poisoned. I saw your wife put poison in it. She shouted, pointing at the plate. There was a commotion all around. The guests rose from their seats, the waiters looked at each other, not knowing what to do. Porridge ran closer, pleading. Please don't eat that. It's the truth. But at that moment, Stanislav had already managed to taste a bite. In a few seconds his face turned pale, he clutched his chest, and his breathing became heavy and ragged. The man began to choke. Kasia, ignoring the shouts and suspicious looks, ran up to him. Hold on. We'll save you. Please, somebody call an ambulance. But instead of help, she heard someone's voice. She put the poison in. It was her. The crowd around her was buzzing like a swarm of angry bees. A guard grabbed Kasia's arm roughly, growling. What have you done, you little brat? She tried to break free, screaming desperately. It's not me. It was his wife. I saw her do it. But no one would listen. They pulled her toward the exit, and Stanislav continued to choke, lying on the floor. Kasia couldn't leave him like that. She twisted out of the guard's grip, jerked as hard as she could, and broke free. With bare feet, she ran back to the table, where Stanislav was already lying on the floor, clutching his chest. His face had taken on a sickly gray hue, and his lips were turning blue. Somebody help me. Call an ambulance. She screamed, kneeling beside the man. Her shaking hands tried to support his head so he wouldn't hit the floor. Kasia looked desperately at the waiters, who stood confusedly to the side. Hurry up. He's dying. Her voice trembled, but was full of determination. Finally, one of the young waiters rushed toward her. What can I do? He asked, all panicked. Help me turn him over. He should be on his side. Kasia gave the command with such confidence that the waiter immediately obeyed. The two of them carefully turned Stanislav to ease his breathing. Kasia did her best to hold his head, whispering. Hold on, please. Don't give up. The noise of the crowd around them grew even louder as someone shouted out. It's her own fault. It was all her doing. Kasia raised her head and shouted. That's a lie. I only wanted to save him. His wife did it. I saw it with my own eyes. But her words were drowned in accusations and noises. Finally, ambulance sirens were heard in the distance. Kasia felt relief, but it was quickly replaced by fear as the police entered the hall. Their stern faces did not bode well. "Where is the girl?" one of them asked loudly, and the guard immediately pointed at Kasia. The officer approached her and grabbed her shoulder roughly. "Is that you? Did you put something in his food?" "No. It's not me. It was his wife. I saw her do it." Kasia tried her best to explain, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. "Are you saying it was Stanislaw Weslowski's wife? Do you realize what you're saying?" The policeman looked at her with obvious disbelief. "Yes, I understand. It was her. I saw it with my own eyes." Kasia shouted, but she felt the cold handcuffs on her wrists. They tried to take her away, but she was still screaming. "Ask him when he wakes up. He'll tell the truth. It's not me. It's her." Meanwhile, the medics were bent over Stanislav, injecting him with the antidote. Kasia watched them work, even as they led her away. Her heart ached at the thought that the truth might never come out. Kasia found herself in a dimly lit police car. Her wrists were handcuffed and her eyes filled with tears. Her thoughts fluttered like wild birds in a cage. What if they don't believe me? What if he dies and I'm left feeling guilty? In the ward, she was seated on a cold metal chair. Two policemen sat across from her, one with bushy eyebrows and a gruff face, the other younger, with a cold and penetrating gaze. "Tell me how you came to be in the restaurant and why you tried to poison Stanislav Weslowski," the older of the two began, squinting his eyes. Kasia raised her head, clenching her teeth to hold back her tears. "I didn't poison anyone. I saw his wife do it. She put something in the food, and I wanted to warn him." The young policeman snorted. "Girl, do you realize how that sounds? You're a tramp, a beggar. Who would believe your words against the Honorable Veronika Weslowska?" "It's true. I saw everything with my own eyes." Kasia raised her voice, feeling fear turn to despair. "Proof?" the first policeman asked, leaning forward slightly. "Video, witnesses? Maybe a note from her found?" Kasia lowered her head. She had nothing but her own words. "That's what I thought," the older man snorted, writing something down in his notebook. "You just made up a story to get away with it." "That's not true," she shouted. "If I wanted to steal something or poison him, why would I shout about it? I could have just left. Or did you decide to make a scene to get noticed?" The younger one put in, playing with his pen. Kasia clutched at the edge of her chair, feeling tears choking her. She couldn't give up. "You must talk to him," she said quietly but firmly. "When he wakes up, he will confirm my words." The policemen looked at each other. The older one shrugged his shoulders. "Let him talk if he comes to his senses. But for now, your words mean nothing." They left her alone in the room. Kasia wrapped her arms around her head, feeling the walls press against her. She didn't know what else to say to be heard. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Stanislav was slowly regaining consciousness. His body was stiff, his head was buzzing, and breathing was difficult. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was the doctor's face. "Welcome back, Mr. Weslowski," the doctor said softly, checking his pulse. "You were on the verge, but fortunately we got there in time." Stanislav tried to remember what had happened. His voice was weak, but he uttered, "The girl, she warned." The doctor frowned. "What girl?" None of the guests had mentioned her. Stanislav closed his eyes, the pieces of memories slowly coming together. "She yelled at me not to eat. She said there was poison in it." The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse, then nodded. "We'll figure it out. But you need to rest now." Stanislav clenched his teeth. He was sure the girl was telling the truth. "She saved my life, and now she's probably suffering for it," he thought. Despite his weakness, he was determined. He would find out what was wrong with her and do whatever it took to free her. He called for the doctor and urged. Find her. It's not her fault. It's Veronica. Check her out. The doctor nodded, realizing that this could be the key to everything. At the police station, Kasia was sitting in the same cold chair when the door opened abruptly. One of the policemen looked worried. Release her. Wisławski has woken up and is demanding to question her. Kasia raised her head, not believing her ears. Her heart beat faster as her handcuffs were removed. Will they really hear me? Ran through her head. Kasia was led out of the interrogation room. She walked down the long hallway of the police station, still in disbelief that she was being released. Her hands were shaking, her wrists aching from the cold handcuffs. She was afraid that this was some kind of mistake and she was about to be taken back. Stanislav was waiting for her at the exit. He stood, leaning lightly on his cane, his face still pale, but determination burning in his eyes. When Kasia saw him, she stopped. It's you, she whispered, not knowing what to say. Stanislav smiled, though it was hard for him to do so. I should have come earlier. I'm sorry I kept you waiting. His voice was warm, but with a note of guilt. Kasia swallowed, feeling her throat go dry. You're alive, was all she could manage to say. Thanks to you, he said firmly. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be standing here now. She didn't know how to react. Everything inside was mixed, relief, joy, and a strange sense of fear. But, why are you helping me? I'm a nobody, she said quietly, lowering her eyes. Stanislav put his hand on her shoulder. You're not a nobody. You're a man who risked everything to save another. And that's a lot more than most can say about themselves. Kasia felt her eyes fill with tears. She was used to being humiliated, to being seen as dirty and unnecessary. This moment seemed unreal to her. Stanislav looked at the police officers. Her case is closed. If you have any questions, ask my lawyer, he said in a cold tone that left no room for objection. When they left the station, Kasia stopped, looking out at the evening city. Her bare feet touched the cold asphalt, but for the first time in a long time, she felt warm. What now? She asked, looking cautiously at Stanislav. He smiled. Now you're coming with me. Half an hour later the car stopped at a large gate. Behind them stood a huge house surrounded by a well-tended garden. Kasia stared at the mansion, holding her breath. Her world up to this point had consisted of garbage cans and cardboard boxes. Is this your house? She asked, barely audibly. It's yours now, too, Stanislav answered, helping her out of the car. Kasia looked around confused. She was afraid to even go inside, as if she might spoil something by her presence. You deserve this. Let me show you to your room. Stanislav smiled and led her through a tall door decorated with carvings. The room he took her to was the most Kasia had ever seen. The snow-white bed, the cozy chair by the window, the neat table, it all seemed from another world. Kasia ran her hand over the soft blanket, feeling her eyes fill with tears again. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, lowering her head. Stanislav smiled softly. You don't need to thank me. Just start living differently. I will help you. Those words were the beginning of a new chapter for her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance at a future. The next days were full of changes for Kasia. Stanislav hired a private teacher so she could study. The first lesson was the hardest, her hands were shaking and the letters were crooked, but she did her best. You will succeed, Stanislav said, watching her attempts. The main thing is not to give up. Every day she discovered something new, books, grammar rules, even simple things like holding a pen, all these became small victories for her. Gradually her eyes, which had been full of fear, began to glow with confidence. She was no longer afraid to look people in the eye. Kasia began to believe that her life could really change. But there were new challenges ahead of her that she didn't even realize yet. After a few months, Kasia began to feel more confident in her new home. Her days were busy studying, reading books, and sometimes even helping Stanislaw with his business. She began to smile more often, and her gaze was no longer clouded with fear. But one evening Stanislaw, who had been supporting her all this time, called Kasia into his office. She walked in and noticed that he looked worried. "Kasia, I need to talk to you," he began, gesturing to the chair opposite. She sat down warily, not knowing what to expect. "Remember I promised we'd find out the truth about that night?" He fell silent, as if gathering his thoughts. "We did." Kasia felt her heart sink. "And what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "We gathered evidence. It turned out that Veronica had indeed tried to poison me. The investigators found a vial of poison residue, and the cooks confirmed that she was in the kitchen, which is forbidden. She thought her position would protect her." Stanislav's voice shook, but not from fear, but from anger. Kasia was silent, digesting what she had heard. "She will be tried, and you will probably be the chief witness," he added, looking at the girl carefully. She froze. The idea of being the center of attention again, especially in a courtroom, terrified her. "But, why? Isn't there enough evidence?" she whispered. Stanislaw nodded. "It's enough for a verdict. But you are the key witness. You saw everything with your own eyes. Your story can help convince everyone that justice has been served." Kasia thought about it. Her past had taught her one thing: to always stay in the shadows to survive. But now she faced a choice: become invisible again, or take responsibility and tell the truth. "Okay," she finally said, taking a deep breath. "I'll do it." On the day of the trial, Kasia sat in the courtroom, nervously tugging at the hem of her dress. Her heart was racing and her thoughts were racing. What if no one believes me again? What if I do something wrong? Veronica, sitting on the bench, looked as confident as ever. Her elegant attire, cool gaze, and proud posture seemed to say that she considered herself above it all. When Kasia was called as a witness, she felt her legs give a shake. She looked at Stanislav, who was sitting in the front rows. His gaze was full of support. Gathering her strength, Kasia stood up and made her way to the podium. "Tell the court what you saw that night," the prosecutor asked. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice shook at first, but with each word she became more confident. She told how she had gone through the garbage, how she had seen Veronica through the kitchen window, how she had added something to the dish. "Why did you decide to intervene?" the prosecutor asked. Kasia raised her head. "I knew someone could get hurt. I couldn't just stand by and watch." Her words hung in the hall, and even Veronica's lawyers looked confused. It wasn't just a story, it was a truth that was impossible not to believe. The judge called a recess, and Kasia returned to her seat next to Stanislav. He said quietly, "You have done well. Now the truth will definitely prevail." She nodded, feeling her fear being replaced by pride. For the first time in her life, she felt that her voice really mattered. The verdict was harsh. Veronica was found guilty of attempted murder and attempting to embezzle her husband's funds. She was sentenced to a long term and her property was partially confiscated. After the trial, Kasia and Stanislav stood on the steps of the building. She raised her eyes to his and asked, "What now?" He smiled. "Now we start a new life. Together." From then on, they worked to create a fund to help children in difficult life situations. Kasia, who had once lived on the streets, was now helping others find their way to a new life. Her past was no longer a stigma, it became her strength. "You're an example for all of us," Stanislav had once told her. She smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that she deserved those words. Several months passed. The foundation that Stanislav and Kasia had created began to gain momentum. They organized charity events, visited orphanages, and helped those in difficult life situations. Kasia, who had once struggled to survive on her own, was now sharing her story with others to inspire them not to give up. One evening they returned from a charity dinner. Stanislav looked tired but content. Kasia noticed him toss his tie on the back of his chair and pour himself a glass of water. "You did brilliantly today," he said, raising his glass. "The children listened to you like they were mesmerized." "That's because I know what they're going through," she replied, smiling slightly. "I think they can see that I'm being sincere." Stanislav looked at her with warmth. "You don't just speak sincerely. You give them hope." Kasia was silent, looking out the window at the night city. Her face lit up in the soft light of the street lamps. She felt like her life had truly changed, but the past still hung over her. "I sometimes wonder. What would have happened if I had just run away back then? Didn't interfere?" she said quietly, without turning her head. Stanislav stepped closer and put his hand on her shoulder. "You didn't run away because you have a good heart. That's what saved me. Don't think about what could have been. Think about what we can do now." Kasia turned around, her eyes glistening with barely held back tears. "Thank you, for everything." Stanislav smiled softly. "It's not only my merit. You yourself proved that you are capable of much." The next day Kasia went to one of the foundation meetings. It was a small room in the suburbs, where children and teenagers in difficult situations gathered. She told them her story and then listened to them. Each story was difficult in its own way. Some had lost their parents, some were on the street because of debts, and some had simply run away from violence. After the meeting, a girl about 8 years old approached her. Her red hair was in 2 unkempt ponytails, and her clothes looked too big, as if they had been taken from her older brothers. "Did you really live on the street?" the girl asked, looking at Kasia in disbelief. "Yes, I did," Kasia answered softly. "And did your rich uncle help you?" The girl squinted, as if trying to figure out if it was a joke or not. Kasia smiled. "He helped me because I helped him. You know, it's important not only to wait for help, but to be ready to help others." The girl thought for a moment, then nodded. "I want to help, too. When I grow up, I will be rich and help everyone on the street." Kasia felt her heart fill with warmth. She realized that even small efforts can change someone's life. A few days later, Stanislav came with news. "Kasia, we received an invitation to a big event. It's a fundraiser hosted by the mayor of the city. They want you to tell your story." Kasia froze, not knowing how to react. "The mayor? I can't. These are such important people." "That's why you have to come forward," Stanislav said firmly. "Your story could open their eyes." Kasia hesitated. Her fear again stood before her like an insurmountable obstacle. But she remembered what she had already been through, and that it was Stanislav who had once told her, "You're stronger than you think." "All right, I'll do it," she finally said, feeling the resolve rising inside her. The evening promised to be a turning point, but Kasia didn't know yet that it would bring an unexpected surprise. The day of the charity event had arrived. Kasia stood in front of the large mirror in her room, looking at the dress that Stanislav had chosen for her. It was modest but elegant, a light blue color that emphasized her youthful beauty. She could hardly believe that this reflection was her. Stanislav was waiting for her downstairs, looking impeccable in a strict suit. When Kasia came downstairs, he smiled. "You look beautiful." Kasia blushed slightly. "Thank you. I'm a little nervous." "That's okay. Just be yourself. You've already proven you can tell the truth. That's the most valuable thing." The event was held in the large hall of the town hall, decorated with candles and flowers. The guests, dressed in expensive outfits, were chatting leisurely, glasses of champagne clinking in the hands of the waiters. Kasia felt out of place. Her eyes darted around the hall, and every loud word spoken in her direction made her even more nervous. But Stanislav was there for her. He supported her, introduced her to the guests, and then escorted her to the stage when it was time. "You can do it," he whispered before she stepped up to the podium. Kasia stood behind the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly, but she took a deep breath and began to speak. "Good evening. My name is Kasia, and honestly, I never thought I would end up here." She fell silent, catching the stares of her guests for a moment. 6 months ago, I was living on the street. My home was a piece of cardboard, and my food was what was left in the dumpsters. A whisper rippled through the room. Some raised their eyebrows in surprise, others looked skeptical. But once I saw something I couldn't ignore. I saw a man in danger, and I did what I could to save him. She talked about how she ended up in the restaurant, how she tried to stop Stanislav, how she was accused and humiliated, but she didn't give up. I couldn't keep quiet because I knew that truth is always more important than fear. And I'm here because someone believed me. Her voice became firmer. What I want now is for children like me to be able not just to survive, but to live. So they can have a chance at a future. The hall was silent. The faces of the guests reflected different emotions: surprise, respect, even embarrassment. Immediately after the performance, several people came up to Kasia, expressing their admiration. She had never heard so many words of support and gratitude. Later that evening, when the event came to an end, Stanislav and Kasia went outside. She breathed in the fresh night air and looked at him. "Do you think I was able to convince anyone?" she asked. "I think you changed someone's life," he replied, smiling. Kasia smiled back. For the first time, she felt that her story really mattered. But the next day, a surprise awaited them. A letter arrived at the foundation's office. There was no signature on it, only initials. Inside was a large check and a short note. "You have inspired me. Use this money to change the lives of others as you have changed yours." Kasia stared at the note, tears glistening in her eyes. "This is unbelievable," she whispered. Stanislav took the note and smiled. This was just the beginning. Now their work had taken on an even larger scale. Kasia realized that her past was no longer a shadow for her. It had become a force that helped others find light in the darkest darkness. A few weeks passed and the foundation began to expand rapidly. Kasia was now not only inspiring children with her story, but also organizing events. She felt she had found her place in life. But she still had one overwhelming desire in her heart: to find out what had happened to Veronica. One morning Stanislav walked into her office. He noticed Kasia looking pensively out the window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting down opposite. "About Veronica," she admitted. "What about her now?" Stanislav gloomed. "She was convicted, she's in prison. But to be honest, I don't want to think about her anymore." Kasia nodded, but her thoughts stayed with her. She realized that her life had changed because she had once not kept silent. But somewhere deep inside she felt that her past with Veronica wasn't over yet. Some time later, an unexpected letter arrived at the foundation. The address was from the prison. Kasia opened the envelope with a shiver in her hands. Inside lay a handwritten note. "You think you've saved him. But this is just the beginning. Take care of yourself." Kasia showed the letter to Stanislav. His face turned hard. "It's a threat," he said, scrutinizing the note. "But why?" "She's already lost," Kasia whispered. "Not everyone can accept defeat. Don't worry, I'll make sure you're safe." Stanislav increased the security, but Kasia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The letter was short, but there was a hidden threat in it. One evening, on her way back from the foundation, Kasia noticed that someone was following her. In the darkness of the street, she felt a cold fear that pierced her to the bone. She quickened her step, looking over her shoulder, but no one showed themselves. When she reached home, she told Stanislav at once. "It could have been an accident," he reassured her. "But we'll still be careful." However, the strangeness did not end there. A few days later, a woman who introduced herself as Veronica's friend came to their event. She wanted to meet with Kasia, but Stanislav insisted that the conversation took place in his presence. "I came with a proposal," the woman said. Her gaze was intense and her voice steady. "Veronica wants to talk to you, Kasia." Kasia froze, feeling everything inside her clench. "Why?" she asked, sensing that this suggestion would not end well. "She says she wants to apologize," the woman replied with a slight smile that made her uncomfortable. Stanislav frowned. "We don't accept such offers. Tell her she'd better concentrate on her punishment." But Kasia suddenly thought that perhaps there might be more to this conversation. "I'll think about it," she said before the woman left. Stanislav was not pleased. This could be a trap. "You should stay away from her." But Kasia felt she couldn't move on if she didn't confront Veronica. Her past, as heavy as it was, now stood before her in full view. "I have to find out what she wants," she said firmly. Stanislav sighed. "If you make up your mind, I'll go with you." Kasia nodded. Her decision was final, and she knew this conversation could change a lot of things. The meeting with Veronica was scheduled at the prison where she was serving her sentence. Kasia and Stanislav went there together, and on the way he tried to change her mind several times. "Are you sure it's necessary?" "She's tricky, Kasia. It could be another game." "I understand," she replied, looking out the car window. "But if I don't meet her, I'll feel like I haven't finished something." The prison greeted them with a heavy atmosphere and the coldness of gray walls. Kasia was led into the visiting room, where there was a metal table and a few simple chairs. She sat down, nervously rubbing the edge of her clothes, and waited. When the door opened, her heart sank. Veronica entered slowly, her posture still as proud as before. She looked graceful even in her simple prison uniform, but her face betrayed fatigue. "You came after all," she said, grinning, and sat down across from Kasia. "Why did you call me here?" Kasia asked at once, trying to be confident. Veronica looked at her, tilting her head as if assessing her. "You surprised me at the restaurant, you know. No one would have expected someone like you to intervene." "I did what I thought was right," Kasia replied firmly. Veronica grinned. "The right thing? You ruined my life. Do you realize that?" Kasia felt anger flaring in her chest. "Me? It was you who tried to poison Stanislav. You're the one who ruined your life." For a moment a shadow flashed in Veronica's eyes, but she immediately pulled herself together. "You're naive. You think the truth always saves the day? In the world of the powerful, the truth is used to their advantage. If you called me to lecture me about life, then I've wasted my time," Kasia replied, getting up. "Wait," Veronica said seriously. "I called you because I want to give you a warning." Kasia sat down again, feeling anxiety overwhelm her. "What kind of warning?" Veronica looked at her with a cold smile. "Stanislav is not who he says he is. You don't know what he's hiding yet." Those words were like a blow. Kasia froze, trying to realize what she had just heard. "What are you talking about?" "He's kind, caring, perfect, isn't he? But everyone has their dark sides." Veronica leaned closer, her voice lower. "Be careful, girl. Sometimes saviors become the worst of enemies." Kasia stared at her, feeling everything turn over inside. She didn't know whether to believe those words, but the look on Veronica's face was frighteningly convincing. When Kasia returned to the car, Stanislav was already waiting for her. "How did it go?" he asked, but his face tensed when he saw her confusion. "She said Kasia hesitated, not knowing how to phrase it. "She said you were hiding something." Stanislav turned dark, his gaze serious. "She said it to sow doubt. You don't have to believe her." Kasia looked into his eyes, trying to understand what he was thinking. She wanted to believe him, but Veronica's words stuck in her head like a splinter. "If you have questions," Stanislav said softly, "just ask me." But Kasia couldn't shake the feeling that she had to be careful now. She trusted Stanislav, but Veronica's voice still echoed in her head, "Sometimes saviors become the worst of enemies." Kasia couldn't get Veronica's words out of her head. For weeks she tried to concentrate on her work at the foundation, but every time she looked at Stanislav she felt a strange shadow of doubt. He was still as kind and caring as ever, but something inside her made her wary. One evening, returning home after a long day, she noticed Stanislav sitting in his office with the door locked. This was unusual, he had never hid from her before. Kasia moved closer and heard muffled voices. Someone was talking to him on the phone. "Yes, everything is going according to plan," Stanislav said. His voice sounded cold, not at all what she was used to hearing. "She trusts me. Everything will be ready soon." Kasia froze. Her heart raced. Who is he talking about? What's ready? She took a step back, trying not to make a sound, and hurried to her room. She couldn't sleep that night. All of Veronica's words came back with renewed vigor. She tried to convince herself that it was a misunderstanding, but the coldness in Stanislav's voice she heard haunted her. The next day, Kasia decided to take action. She waited for the moment when Stanislav would leave for a meeting, so she walked into his office. Looking for an answer, her gaze fell on the locked desk drawer. Her hands trembled as she tried to find the key. Finally, she found it in a drawer and opened the nightstand. There were papers inside, but one file caught her eye. They were papers related to the foundation, but there was something about them that didn't add up. The numbers were too big, the amounts were suspicious. Her heart clenched as she realized that some of the foundation's donations had been misused. She quickly took pictures of the documents before putting everything back where it belonged. Kasia called the lawyer they worked with on the foundation's cases. She showed him the photos, and he couldn't hide his surprise. "This is serious," he said, frowning. "If all this is true, the foundation is involved in money laundering." "But Stanislav, he can't be involved," Kasia started, but her voice shook. The lawyer only shook his head. "You have to be prepared for the truth to be unpleasant." That night Stanislav came home in a good mood. He looked as usual, but Kasia already saw him differently. She couldn't hold back any longer. "You're hiding something," she said firmly when they were alone. Stanislav raised his eyebrows in surprise. "What are you talking about?" "About the foundation, about the money, and about what you're really doing." His face turned pale, and for a moment she saw him lose control. But he quickly pulled himself together. "Who told you that? Veronica? You believe the woman who tried to kill me? I heard you on the phone. I saw the documents. What's going on, Stanislav?" Her voice shook, but she stood firm. He came closer, his gaze became cold. "You ask too many questions, Kasia." Those words made her pull back. "Were you using me? All this time?" she asked, feeling the pain growing in her chest. Stanislav took a deep breath. "You have to understand. This is business. And you're just part of the plan." Kasia felt her world crumble. She couldn't believe that the man who had saved her was capable of such a thing. "I'll go," she said firmly. "And I will tell everyone." But Stanislav grinned. "You're not going anywhere. Do you think anyone will believe a girl from the street?" Those words hit her, but instead of breaking down, Kasia felt anger boiling inside her. She escaped that night. With the documents she had managed to copy, Kasia went to the police. She knew it would be difficult to prove her case, but she couldn't keep silent any longer. The case against Stanislav soon became high-profile. His connections, his foundation, everything turned out to be part of a big scam. Kasia was a witness, and her testimony was crucial. When it was over, she was alone. But instead of fear, she felt relief. A few months later, the foundation was reorganized. Now it was really helping children, without ulterior motives or dirty schemes. Kasia became its head, proving that even in the most difficult circumstances one can find the strength to go on. She looked out the office window at the city and thought about how far she'd come. Her story hadn't been easy, but it had taught her the most important thing: even the dark chapters of life could be the beginning of something light. Now her life belonged not only to her, but to those she could help. And Kasia was ready for whatever challenges still lay ahead of her.